Deep in the Colorado Rockies, beneath decades of fallen leaves and forgotten time, sits a cabin that shouldn't exist. When Tom and Sarah Mitchell stumbled across this weathered structure during their anniversary hike, they expected nothing more than shelter from an approaching storm. What they found instead would shatter their quiet retirement and thrust them into a dangerous world they never knew existed. Behind a loose floorboard lay a steel vault containing $150 million in gold, bars and classified documents dating back to 1962. The papers revealed a government experiment, so secret that powerful people would kill to keep it buried. Now, with shadowy figures closing in and their peaceful mountain retreat becoming a battlefield, the Mitchells face an impossible choice. But what was this experiment that someone desperately wants to keep hidden after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of the Mitchell home in Golden, Colorado, where Sarah sat with her second cup of coffee. At 67, she still rose early, a habit formed during 35 years of marriage to Tom, who preferred mountain trails to evening crowds. Their modest home had been chosen for its proximity to the foothills and endless weekend adventures. Tom emerged from his study, reading glasses perched on his nose as he examined a topographical map. At 70, his silver hair had thinned, but his blue eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him a respected geology professor before retirement. His weathered hands traced elevation lines with practiced ease. "The trail to Bear Creek should be clear," he said, settling across from Sarah. "I want to check that rock formation before tourist season begins." Sarah smiled, the same warm expression that had captivated him at the university library in 1988. She had been head librarian then, helping a frustrated geology professor locate obscure texts. Their courtship unfolded among dusty stacks, built on shared conversations about discovery and understanding the world's hidden stories. 35 years. "And you still get that look talking about rocks," Sarah teased affectionately. Their relationship had weathered academic pressures, tight budgets, and heartbreak before their children arrived. Now, with Jennifer working as a pediatric nurse in Denver and Michael practicing environmental law in Boulder, they enjoyed their second honeymoon phase. "Speaking of discoveries," Sarah said, retrieving a manila envelope, "I've been going through Dad's papers. There are documents I don't understand." Colonel Robert Harrison had died 6 months earlier at 91, taking military stories that had grown increasingly vague in his final years. He had served during the Cold War, stationed across the western United States, but remained reluctant to discuss specifics. Sarah attributed his reticence to typical military discretion. She spread documents across the table: standard personnel records, commendation letters, transfer orders. But buried among routine paperwork were anomalies: authorization forms for Special Assignment Aurora, travel vouchers for unmappable locations, and medical clearance forms mentioning psychological evaluations and experimental protocols. Tom leaned forward, his geological training making him methodical. "This signature appears on multiple forms, but the title's unclear. Something about research coordination and mountain facility operations." "Dad always said he was in logistics," Sarah replied. "But these suggest something more specialized." She pulled out a photograph showing military uniforms in front of a concrete building set into a mountainside. Robert Harrison was clearly visible, his expression notably troubled. The photograph's back read in her father's handwriting, "Project Aurora Team, Site 7, June 1962. May God forgive us for what we've learned." Tom studied the terrain. The rock formations looked familiar. This could be somewhere in the Front Range. The granite outcroppings match higher elevations. Sarah had inherited more than documents. The house sale yielded boxes of books on psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive manipulation research. For a man claiming military supply work, Robert Harrison possessed an extensive library on subjects far removed from logistics. Their conversation was interrupted by Jennifer's arrival. At 42, she shared her mother's intelligence and father's curiosity. She greeted both parents before noticing the documents. "More of Grandpa's papers?" she asked. "Mom, you've been obsessing over these for months. Maybe accept that his service was classified and move on." "These aren't traditionally classified," Sarah replied. "They're fragments of something larger, deliberately scattered. Some medical forms mention procedures that sound like experiments." Jennifer examined the Aurora photograph, noting her grandfather's expression. He looked scared. "I've never seen Grandpa look scared." Tom gathered documents carefully. "Sarah, what if we approach this like research? You have archival skills. I know regional geography. Maybe we could piece together more." The suggestion appealed to Sarah's professional instincts and personal need to understand her father's legacy. Their discussion continued as they planned their Bear Creek hiking trip. Tom's surveys had identified areas matching the Aurora photograph's background, while Sarah's research uncovered references to mountain facilities in her father's documents. As they prepared hiking gear, Sarah felt anticipation mixed with unease. Their peaceful retirement had been filled with quiet adventures and comfortable routines. But her father's mysterious papers had awakened something restless, a need to understand the truth about the man who raised her. Neither could anticipate that their next mountain adventure would transform their quiet retirement into something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. 3 days later, Tom and Sarah returned to the mysterious cabin with proper tools and determination. The storm that initially drove them to seek shelter had passed, leaving crisp mountain air. Tom carried geological equipment while Sarah brought her camera, notebook, and archival magnifying glass. The cabin appeared more weathered in daylight, its logs silvered by mountain weather. What seemed like simple abandonment during the storm now revealed deliberate construction. Tom noted careful foundation placement and quality craftsmanship, suggesting purpose beyond casual shelter. "Look at this," Tom said, kneeling beside the foundation. These support beams were installed by someone understanding structural engineering. This wasn't built by a weekend prospector. Sarah documented everything methodically, applying archival approaches she'd used for decades. The broken floorboard revealing the vault now appeared less accidental than strategic, as if deliberately loosened. Inside, Tom examined the vault opening carefully. The military-grade steel hatch was installed with precision, sealed with mechanisms preserving contents for 60 years. This required professional installation. Heavy equipment would have been needed, and excavation work would have taken weeks. Sarah focused on Project Aurora documents spread across the cabin floor. The files revealed systematic psychological experimentation operating from 1959 to 1965, detailing behavior modification, memory suppression, and euphemistic cognitive restructuring of human subjects. "Tom, look at this," Sarah said, voice tight with emotion. She held a document bearing her father's signature witnessing Protocol 7. The description was stomach-turning, detailed accounts of experiments designed to break down individual personality and rebuild subjects. According to predetermined patterns, the most disturbing discovery was Dr. Helena Vasquez's personal journal in a waterproof container. Vasquez had been Aurora's chief psychologist, her handwritten entries chronicling growing horror at the program's direction. Early entries showed scientific enthusiasm for breakthrough psychology research. Later pages revealed desperate attempts to document what she increasingly recognized as systematic torture, disguised as medical research. "They started with volunteers," Sarah read aloud. "Military personnel, believing they contributed to national defense research. But by 1962, they used prisoners, mental patients, and people declared missing. The Oversight Committee stopped asking questions when preliminary. Results showed battlefield applications promise. Tom discovered additional vault compartments hidden behind, false panels requiring geological tools to access. These contained personal effects of Aurora scientists, family photographs, unsent letters. and journals documenting struggles with ethical implications. One photograph particularly caught Sarah's attention, showing her father with Dr. Vasquez and two others in front of the same mountain facility from his estate papers. But here, her father's expression wasn't troubled. It was determined, almost defiant. Someone had written on the back, "The ones who said no." July 1963. "I think Dad was part of something," Sarah said slowly. "Not just witnessing Project Aurora, but opposing it from within." Tom's geological analysis revealed disturbing vault construction information. The concrete and steel showed evidence of extreme haste during late 1962, suggesting someone needed to hide materials quickly. His terrain examination indicated the cabin sat above natural cave systems, extending deep into the mountain. "Sarah, there's more down there," Tom said, pointing to hairline cracks suggesting additional chambers below. "This vault might just be the entrance to something much larger." Using geological equipment, Tom mapped what appeared to be an extensive underground complex. The natural cave system had been modified and expanded, creating a hidden facility that could house significant operations without aerial detection. Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the vault's final compartment was a letter addressed to her, written in her father's handwriting and dated 3 months before his death. "My dear Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, you have found what I hoped you would never need to find. I've spent 50 years carrying Project Aurora's weight, and I fear some people will never allow that truth to remain buried. There are others like me, survivors who tried to stop what we saw. But we were not strong enough to expose it completely." The letter continued, with specific instructions for finding additional cache sites. Including geographical references Tom immediately recognized as remote Rocky Mountain locations. Robert Harrison had spent final years not in confused dementia, but in careful preparation for this moment. "The gold you found was payment for our silence. Those who objected were given a choice: disappear quietly with compensation, or face consequences extending to our families. I took the money and remained silent, but never stopped documenting what I knew. The real evidence is scattered across 7 sites. You're hidden where only someone with your skills and Tom's knowledge could find it." Sarah felt tears as she read her father's final words. "I was not brave enough to speak out when it mattered. But perhaps you will be braver than I was. Trust no one in authority until you have all the evidence. They are still watching, and they are still afraid of what we know." Tom found evidence supporting Robert Harrison's warnings. Fresh tire tracks near the cabin suggested recent visitors, and examination revealed subtle signs their initial discovery hadn't gone unnoticed. Broken branches and disturbed undergrowth indicated systematic surveillance. "We're not alone in knowing about this place," Tom said quietly. "Someone has been monitoring this site, probably for years." As they prepared to leave, both felt the weight of their discovery. They possessed evidence of government-sponsored human experimentation, financial records showing silence payments, and geographical information pointing to additional hidden sites. But they also had confirmation that powerful people were actively protecting these secrets. The Golden Public Library became Sarah's second home over following weeks. Her years as university head librarian had taught her to navigate research databases and government archives with surgical precision. Now those skills served a personal purpose as she methodically tracked every reference to Project Aurora in publicly accessible records. Tom joined her most afternoons, spreading geological surveys and topographical maps across large tables. His terrain expertise helped identify potential locations for other cache sites mentioned in her father's letter. Their research partnership gradually revealed the scope of what they were investigating. "Look at this," Sarah whispered, sliding a printout to Tom. She had found a 1963 congressional budget report, including a line item for mountain research facilities. Classification: Level 7. The allocated amount was staggering, $15 million across multiple Colorado, Utah, and Montana sites. Tom studied geographical references, cross-referencing with geological surveys. These coordinates place facilities in the most remote Rocky Mountain terrain, areas where large-scale operations could occur without accidental discovery. Their research attracted Marcus Chen's attention, a man in his 50s who approached cautiously one afternoon. Marcus had the careful manner of someone accustomed to looking over his shoulder, and his introduction immediately alerted both Sarah and Tom. "I couldn't help noticing your research materials," Marcus said, settling into an empty chair. "Project Aurora isn't something most people know to look for. I'm wondering if you might be the people I've been hoping to find for 20 years. Marcus explained he had been a Denver Post investigative journalist until 1998, when his investigation into Cold War-era government programs cost him his career and nearly his life. He had been tracking survivors of various classified experiments, trying to piece together a comprehensive picture of programs operating outside legal oversight for decades. Project Aurora was the worst, Marcus continued quietly. Other programs tested drugs or psychological techniques on volunteers or prisoners. Aurora went further. They were trying to completely rebuild human personality, creating people who could be programmed for specific missions and then have those memories erased. Sarah felt her blood chill as Marcus described techniques matching Dr. Vasquez's journal procedures. "You're saying they were creating human robots?" "Worse," Marcus replied. "They were creating people who believed they acted on free will, but were actually following implanted instructions. Intelligence applications were obvious, but potential domestic use terrified some scientists involved." Marcus pulled out a worn notebook filled with names, dates, and locations accumulated over decades. "I've documented over 300 direct subjects, but program records suggest much higher numbers. Most subjects were people who wouldn't be missed: homeless individuals, mental patients, prisoners serving long sentences. But some were military volunteers with no idea what they agreed to participate in. The journalist's research had led him to Elena Morrison, an elderly woman living under an assumed name in a small mountain town outside Boulder. Elena had been Dr. Vasquez's research assistant during Aurora's early years, before the program shifted toward extreme applications. "Elena has been hiding for 60 years, Marcus explained. "She witnessed things that would expose not just the original Aurora program, but its continuation in modified forms. The people who ran Aurora didn't disappear in 1965. They moved into other agencies, other programs, protecting their secrets ever since." Sarah showed Marcus her father's photograph and letter. Marcus studied the documents, then pulled out his own 1960s photographs. "Your father was part of the resistance within Aurora," Marcus said definitively. "About a dozen military personnel and scientists tried to document and expose what was happening. Most died in accidents or disappeared entirely, but a few, like your father, were given the choice to remain silent in exchange for their families' safety." Over following days, Tom and Sarah noticed increased surveillance around their home and daily activities. Their phone calls developed subtle clicking sounds, suggesting monitoring, and mail delivery became irregular. Sarah's librarian instincts recognized systematic information-gathering signs, while Tom's scientific training helped document the surveillance pattern. Marcus arranged a meeting with Elena Morrison at a small Netherlands diner, where conversation would be less likely to attract attention. Elena was 83, but retained sharp, detailed Aurora memories. She had spent 6 decades hiding, changing names and locations multiple times to avoid people who had threatened her family if she ever spoke publicly about what she witnessed. Dr. Vasquez was a good woman who got involved in something terrible, Elena told Sarah over cold coffee. She initially believed the research would help treat combat trauma and severe mental illness. But by 1962, it had become something monstrous. Elena described experiments beyond anything documented in the journal they had found. Subjects were kept in underground chambers for months, subjected to drug combinations, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation designed to completely break down existing personalities. Once complete, researchers would attempt rebuilding the subject's mind according to predetermined specifications. They wanted to create people who could be activated for specific missions, Elena explained. Someone who could live normally for years, then receive a trigger phrase, transforming them into a completely different person with different skills, loyalties, and objectives. When the mission was complete, another trigger would erase all memory of what they had done. Sarah asked about her father's specific role in opposing the program. Elena smiled for the first time during their conversation. Robert Harrison saved my life and at least 20 others. When some of us realized what Aurora really was, he helped us document evidence and plan our escape. The gold you found was part of a larger fund that Robert and others accumulated to help Aurora refugees disappear and start new lives. Elena confirmed Marcus's suspicions about suspicious deaths among former Aurora personnel and provided additional names of people who had died under questionable circumstances. The program never really ended, she said. It evolved, moved into other agencies, and continued under different names. Some techniques developed at Aurora are still being used today, just with better technology and more sophisticated applications. Despite the danger, Elena was willing to help them access additional evidence that could expose Aurora's full scope and continuation. She had maintained contact with other survivors over decades, creating an informal network, sharing information, and providing mutual protection. The safe house Marcus arranged was a modest cabin outside Ward, Colorado, chosen for isolation and multiple escape routes the surrounding terrain provided. Tom spent 2 days surveying the area, identifying natural caves and old mining shafts that could serve as hiding places if discovered. Elena arrived on a snowy Thursday morning with 3 other program survivors who had remained in contact over decades. Their stories filled crucial gaps in the historical record and provided personal testimony, giving human faces to clinical documentation. Dorothy Williams was 79, a former psychiatric nurse recruited to assist with Aurora research, believing she was helping develop combat trauma treatments. Her detailed medical procedure knowledge provided crucial evidence of systematic torture disguised as legitimate research. James Redmond had been a 22-year-old Army volunteer who agreed to participate in what he was told were stress-tolerance experiments. Instead, he became subject to memory manipulation techniques, leaving permanent gaps in recollection and recurring nightmares about experiences he couldn't remember. Margaret Santos had worked as an Aurora translator, helping interview non-English-speaking subjects. Her linguistic skills gave her access to communications between facility administrators and Washington superiors, revealing the program's true scope and objectives. Together, these survivors painted a picture of systematic human rights violations exceeding anything in official records. More importantly, they provided evidence that Project Aurora had never truly ended. Techniques developed in the 1960s had been refined and continued under different names and agencies. With some applications still active in contemporary government operations, the revelation came from an unexpected source. Margaret Santos had maintained contact with former Aurora linguist David Chen, Marcus's younger brother, who had spent his career working for various intelligence agencies. David agreed to meet them at a truck stop outside Grand Junction, claiming he had information that would change everything they thought they knew about Project Aurora. David Chen was 68, with the careful manner of someone who had spent decades keeping dangerous secrets. Unlike his journalist brother, David had remained within government service, moving between agencies and maintaining security clearances, giving him access to civilian unavailable information. Aurora never ended, David told them without preamble. It evolved, adapted, and found new homes within legitimate government programs. What you've been investigating is just the historical foundation for operations that are active right now. He spread several documents across the table, shielding them from other diners' view. The papers were contemporary government contracts, budget authorizations, and personnel assignments using coded language to describe programs with obvious Aurora research technique connections. Sarah examined documents with her trained librarian's eye, immediately recognizing bureaucratic structure and formatting indicating authentic government materials. But the content was far more disturbing than anything found in historical cache sites. These were current operations, funded with modern budgets and staffed by people applying Aurora techniques to contemporary subjects. Project Mindbridge, David explained, pointing to a contract dated 6 months earlier, is Aurora's direct descendant. It operates out of 3 facilities in Colorado, Utah, and Montana, using updated versions of the same basic techniques your father and colleagues documented in the 1960s. Tom studied geographical references, immediately recognizing several locations, matching sites, mentioned in Robert Harrison's geological surveys. They're using the same underground facilities, he realized. The installations your father helped map are still active, just under different administrative structures. David confirmed Tom's analysis and provided additional information, recontextualizing everything they had discovered. The survivor network hadn't just been hiding from historical persecutors. They had been avoiding people actively protecting current operations, depending on Aurora-originated techniques. Sarah discovered her father's access codes weren't just historical artifacts. They were still valid credentials, providing entry to active Mindbridge facilities. Robert Harrison had maintained security clearances and access privileges throughout retirement, possibly as insurance against people who had forced his silence decades earlier. The documents David provided included personnel files showing several Aurora veterans had moved into leadership positions within agencies currently funding Mindbridge operations. Aurora's secret protection wasn't just about covering past crimes. It was about protecting billions in current contracts and preventing exposure of ongoing human rights violations. Tom realized his geological expertise was needed because Mindbridge was expanding its underground facility network. New installations were being constructed in remote mountain locations, using the same natural cave systems and geological features that had hidden Aurora facilities in the 1960s. The Mindbridge facility, hidden beneath Mount Elbert, represented 60 years of psychological experimentation, refined into sophisticated operations bearing little resemblance to crude Aurora installations. Tom's geological analysis had identified the location using David Chen's coordinates, cross-referenced with natural cave formations supporting extensive underground construction. Sarah tested her father's access badge at the facility's concealed entrance, a steel door built into apparent natural rock formation. The electronic lock accepted Robert Harrison's credentials without question, confirming his security clearance had been maintained. Throughout retirement as insurance against potential program exposure, the facility's interior revealed Aurora technique evolution from experimental procedures to operational applications. Tom's geological expertise proved crucial, navigating corridors carved from living rock, following modified natural cave systems, creating a complex extending deep into the mountain. Marcus carried recording equipment designed to document evidence that could expose Mindbridge operations to international scrutiny. His 20 years of investigative experience had taught him the importance of gathering multiple proof forms, audio recordings, video documentation, and physical evidence that would withstand legal challenges and government denials. The first level contained administrative offices and research laboratories resembling legitimate medical installations. Sarah's librarian training helped her identify and copy crucial documents revealing current operation scope, subject intake records, experimental protocols, and budget authorizations proving MindBridge processed hundreds of people annually using Aurora-identical techniques. Elena had insisted on accompanying them despite advanced age and obvious dangers. Her first-hand Aurora procedure knowledge allowed her to interpret what they were seeing and guide them toward the most important evidence. Tom discovered the facility's construction had exploited natural geological features, making detection nearly impossible. Ventilation systems used natural air currents, waste disposal connected to underground streams, and the facility's power grid tapped geothermal sources, leaving no surface signatures. The second level housed processing units, individual chambers where subjects underwent systematic personality breakdown and reconstruction, forming MindBridge Operations Core. Sarah found detailed records showing current procedures had been refined based on 60 years of experience. But fundamental approaches remained Aurora identical. The third level contained active subject quarters, where their mission transformed from documentation to rescue. Sarah found herself face-to-face with people currently undergoing MindBridge processing, individuals whose personalities were being systematically destroyed and rebuilt according to predetermined specifications. Tom's geological knowledge became crucial planning subject evacuation. The natural cave system connecting to the facility provided multiple escape routes, but navigating them safely would require his underground terrain expertise and mountain geological structure understanding. The coordinated exposure began at exactly midnight Mountain Time, with Aurora survivors across 7 states simultaneously releasing documentation to news organizations, human rights groups, and international oversight bodies. Elena's network had spent 60 years preparing for this moment, establishing secure communication channels and trusted contacts, ensuring evidence reached audiences beyond government suppression efforts. Sarah initiated digital upload from the MindBridge facility itself, using her father's access credentials to penetrate the program's communication systems and broadcast complete operation documentation to worldwide recipients. The irony of using Aurora security clearances to expose Aurora's continuation was not lost on her. Tom led current MindBridge subject evacuation through the cave system he had mapped during infiltration. His geological expertise proved crucial, navigating underground passages in darkness, moving 17 people of varying psychological states through terrain requiring precise rock formation and underground water flow knowledge. Marcus positioned himself in the facility's communication center, using journalistic contacts to coordinate simultaneous revelations across multiple time zones. His 20 years investigating Aurora had prepared him for this moment, working methodically to ensure evidence reached news organizations in countries where government pressure would be less effective in suppressing coverage. The facility's security systems detected their activities within hours, triggering automatic lockdown procedures preventing unauthorized access or exit. But Tom's geological surveys had identified alternative routes through natural cave systems connecting to surface exits miles from the main facility. Elena remained with the most severely damaged subjects, using techniques the survivor network had developed over decades to provide psychological support during extraction confusion and disorientation. Her first-hand Aurora procedure experience made her uniquely qualified to help current victims understand what had been done to them. Sarah confronted Director Phillips in his secure command-level office, using her father's access codes to penetrate areas that should have been completely restricted. Phillips was a man in his 70s who had spent his entire career advancing Aurora research, beginning as a junior psychologist in the original program and eventually rising to direct current operations. "Your father was a remarkable man," Phillips told Sarah, with seeming genuine respect. "His documentation was so thorough and accurate that we used his geological surveys when we expanded these facilities." Phillips revealed that Robert Harrison's Aurora opposition had been more complex than simple moral objection. He had recognized that developing techniques could be refined and improved, but insisted they should be used only for legitimate medical applications rather than intelligence operations or population control. Sarah realized her father's moral struggle had been even more complicated than she understood. He had chosen to work within the system rather than destroy it completely, believing he could influence the program's direction and prevent its worst applications. Tom's geological knowledge became crucial as facility security forces attempted to prevent their escape. The underground complex had been designed with sophisticated containment measures, but those systems assumed intruders would attempt exiting through constructed passages rather than natural cave formations. Marcus sacrificed himself to ensure evidence upload reached completion, and news organizations received all documentation needed to expose mine bridge operations comprehensively. His decision to remain behind and continue transmitting while security forces closed in represented the culmination of 20 years of investigation. The coordinated global media release began at 6:00 a.m. Eastern Time, with news organizations across 6 continents simultaneously broadcasting Sarah's live testimony alongside comprehensive Project Aurora documentation. The synchronized revelation overwhelmed government capacity to suppress information as evidence flooded multiple channels. Simultaneously, Sarah's live video testimony reached an estimated 50 million viewers worldwide within the first hour. Her calm and detailed presentation providing credible witness testimony that gave human context to clinical documentation being released. Tom led coordinated rescue operations at 3 Aurora facilities, using his geological expertise to guide law enforcement teams through underground complexes where 47 current subjects were being held. His maps and structural analysis proved crucial navigating installations designed to prevent external access. Elena's emergence from 60 years of hiding provided international media with a credible witness whose detailed Aurora procedure knowledge gave authority to survivor testimony. Her willingness to sacrifice anonymity for justice inspired other survivors worldwide to break silence and provide additional confirmation. Government response was immediate but ineffective, as official denials were contradicted by overwhelming documentation and survivor testimony, providing specific details about personnel, locations, and procedures. The comprehensive evidence nature made traditional damage control strategies impossible to implement successfully. 1 year after, Aurora revelations transformed global understanding of government experimentation and human rights violations. Sarah and Tom stood in the memorial garden dedicated to Aurora victims at the original mountain cabin site where their journey began. The weathered structure had been preserved as a historical monument, but the surrounding area now hosted a comprehensive educational center documenting psychological experimentation crimes full scope. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Human Rights had become an international organization providing Aurora survivor support while advocating for stronger protections against future government and corporate experimentation on human subjects. Ildina served as the Foundation's primary witness coordinator, helping hundreds of survivors worldwide receive needed medical care, legal representation, and psychological support. Tom had published a geological guide for identifying hidden underground facilities, providing investigators and human rights organizations with practical tools for locating installations that might house ongoing experimental programs. His expertise had proven crucial in exposing Aurora operations, and his manual ensured similar detection capabilities would be available to future investigators. Elena's survivor network had evolved into a formal organization with legal status and government funding to provide comprehensive services for psychological experimentation victims. Her 60 years of hiding had ended with international recognition as a human rights advocate whose courage had inspired global accountability efforts. The legal aftermath had resulted in criminal prosecutions, civil settlements, and international treaties establishing new human experimentation oversight standards. While some perpetrators escaped justice through death or diplomatic immunity, systematic Aurora crime exposure had created precedents, protecting future generations from similar violations. Sarah's book documenting their investigation, and her father's legacy had become required, reading in university courses on ethics, human rights, and government accountability. Robert Harrison's story had inspired other families to examine their histories and question official narratives about classified programs affecting their relatives. As they prepared to leave the memorial garden, Sarah placed a fresh copy of her father's letter beside the bronze plaque honoring Aurora victims. The mountains that had hidden systematic crimes for decades now stood as symbols of truth's power to overcome institutional secrecy and ordinary people's courage to demand justice from those wielding authority without accountability. The Golden Public Library had become Sarah's second home over the following weeks as she methodically tracked down every reference to Project Aurora in publicly accessible records. Her years as head librarian at the university had taught her to navigate research databases and government archives with surgical precision, skills that now served a deeply personal purpose. Tom joined her most afternoons, spreading geological surveys and topographical maps across the library's large tables. His expertise in reading terrain helped identify potential locations for the other cache sites mentioned in her father's letter. The combination of Sarah's archival skills and Tom's geographical knowledge created a research partnership that gradually revealed the true scope of what they were investigating. Their research attracted the attention of Marcus Chen, a careful man in his 50s who approached them cautiously one afternoon as they worked in the library's research section. Marcus had the watchful manner of someone accustomed to looking over his shoulder, and his introduction immediately put both Sarah and Tom on alert. "I couldn't help noticing your research materials," Marcus said, settling into an empty chair at their table. "Project Aurora isn't something most people know to look for. I'm wondering if you might be the people I've been hoping to find for 20 years. Marcus explained that he had been an investigative journalist for the Denver Post until 1998, when his investigation into Cold War-era government programs had cost him his career and nearly his life. He had been tracking survivors of various classified experiments for 2 decades, trying to piece together a comprehensive picture of programs that had operated outside legal oversight. Project Aurora was the worst of them, Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The other programs focused on testing drugs or psychological techniques on volunteers or prisoners. Aurora went further. They were trying to completely rebuild human personality from scratch, creating people who could be programmed for specific missions and then have those memories erased. Sarah felt her blood chill as Marcus described techniques that matched the procedures outlined in Dr. Vasquez's journal. The scope of what her father had been involved in was far more extensive and sinister than anything she had imagined during their initial discovery. At the mountain cabin, Marcus pulled out a worn notebook filled with names, dates, and locations accumulated over decades of investigation. "I've documented over 300 direct subjects, but the program records suggest the actual number was much higher. Most of the subjects were people who wouldn't be missed. Homeless individuals, mental patients, prisoners serving long sentences. But some were military volunteers who had no idea what they were agreeing to participate in." The journalist's research had led him to Elena Morrison, an elderly woman living under an assumed name in a small mountain town outside Boulder. Elena had been Dr. Vasquez's research assistant during the early years of Project Aurora. before the program's direction had shifted toward more extreme applications that violated every principle of medical ethics and human dignity. Over the following days, Tom and Sarah noticed increased surveillance around their home and during their daily activities. Their phone calls developed subtle clicking sounds that suggested monitoring, and their mail delivery became irregular in ways that indicated systematic interference. Sarah's librarian instincts recognized the signs of systematic information gathering, while Tom's scientific training helped him document the pattern of surveillance with methodical precision. Marcus arranged a meeting with Eleanor Morrison at a small diner in Netherlands, a mountain town where their conversation would be less likely to attract unwanted attention. Elena was 83 years old, but her memory of Project Aurora remained sharp and detailed despite the decades that had passed since her escape from the program. Dr. Vasquez was a good woman who got involved in something terrible. Elena told Sarah over coffee that had grown cold as she spoke. She believed initially that the research would help treat combat trauma and severe mental illness. But by 1962, it had become something monstrous that violated every principle of human decency. Elena described experiments that went far beyond anything documented in the journal they had found at the cabin. Subjects were kept in underground chambers for months at a time, subjected to combinations of drugs, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation designed to completely break down their existing personalities. Once that process was complete, researchers would attempt to rebuild the subject's mind according to predetermined specifications. They wanted to create people who could be activated for specific missions, Elena explained, her voice heavy with the weight of terrible memories. Someone who could live a normal life for years, then receive a trigger phrase that would transform them into a completely different person with different skills, loyalties, and objectives. When the mission was complete, another trigger would erase all memory of what they had done. Sarah asked about her father's specific role in opposing the program, desperate to understand how the man who had raised her with such love and kindness had become involved in something so fundamentally evil. Elena smiled for the first time during their conversation, her expression warming as she recalled Robert Harrison's courage in the face of institutional horror. "Robert Harrison saved my life and the lives of at least 20 other people," Elena said with quiet conviction. "When some of us realized what Aurora was really about, he helped us document evidence and plan our escape. The gold you found was part of a larger fund that Robert and others accumulated to help Aurora. Refugees disappear and start new lives far from the people who would kill them for what they knew. The safe house Marcus had arranged was a modest cabin outside Ward, Colorado, deliberately chosen for its isolation and the multiple escape routes the surrounding terrain provided. Tom had spent 2 days surveying the area using his geological expertise, identifying natural caves and old mining shafts that could serve as hiding places if their location was discovered by the people who had been tracking their investigation. Elena arrived on a snowy Thursday morning, bringing with her 3 other survivors of the program who had remained in contact over the decades through an informal network of mutual protection and shared vigilance. Their stories filled in crucial gaps in the historical record and provided personal testimony that gave human faces to the clinical documentation they had been studying. Dorothy Williams was 79 years old and had been a psychiatric nurse at a Denver hospital when she was recruited to assist with Aurora research under the belief that she was helping develop new treatments for combat trauma. Her detailed knowledge of the medical procedures used in the program provided crucial evidence of systematic torture disguised as legitimate research. James Redmond had been a 22-year-old Army volunteer who agreed to participate in what he was told were stress tolerance experiments designed to improve military training methods. Instead, he became the subject of memory manipulation techniques that left him with permanent gaps in his recollection and recurring nightmares about experiences he couldn't quite remember even after 60 years. Margaret Santos had worked as a translator for Aurora, helping to interview subjects who spoke languages other than English and providing linguistic support for the international aspects of the program. Her skills had given her access to communications between facility administrators and their superiors in Washington, conversations that revealed the program's true scope and objectives. Together, these survivors painted a picture of systematic human rights violations that exceeded anything documented in official records that had survived the program's official termination. But more importantly, they provided Sarah and Tom with evidence that Project Aurora had never truly ended, but had evolved and continued under different names and agencies. The revelation that changed everything came from David Chen, Marcus's younger brother, who had spent his career working for various intelligence agencies while maintaining the security clearances that gave him access to information civilians could never obtain. David's decision to break his silence after 40 years of keeping dangerous secrets suggested that something fundamental had changed in the situation they were investigating. Aurora never ended. David told them without preamble as they gathered in a truck stop outside Grand Junction. It evolved, adapted, and found new homes within legitimate government programs. What you've been investigating is just the historical foundation for operations that are active right now, processing subjects and refining techniques that were originally developed 60 years ago. The documents David provided were contemporary government contracts, budget authorizations, and personnel assignments that used coded language to describe programs with obvious connections to Aurora research techniques. Sarah examined them with her trained librarian's eye, immediately recognizing the bureaucratic structure and formatting that indicated authentic government materials. Project Mindbridge, David explained, pointing to a contract dated just 6 months earlier, is Aurora's direct descendant. It operates out of underground facilities in Colorado, Utah, and Montana, using updated versions of the same basic techniques your father and his colleagues documented in the 1960s, but with modern technology and more sophisticated legal protections. Tom studied the geographical references in the contracts, immediately recognizing several locations that matched sites mentioned in Robert Harrison's geological surveys. The installations that Sarah's father had helped map during his Aurora assignment were still active, just operating under different administrative structures, and with far more extensive resources than the original program had possessed. The corporate partnership agreements that Elena discovered in her final cache revealed a dimension of the Aurora conspiracy that none of them had anticipated. Private defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and technology firms had been developing commercial applications for Aurora techniques, transforming government research into profitable products that were being sold to law enforcement agencies, private security firms, and foreign governments. Sarah examined the contracts with her librarian's analytical skills, identifying connections between Aurora research and contemporary industries that most people would never associate with psychological experimentation. Companies that marketed themselves as providers of enhanced interrogation training, advanced behavioral analysis software, and specialized pharmaceuticals for correctional facilities were actually commercializing techniques that had been developed through systematic torture of unwilling subjects. The Mindbridge facility hidden beneath Mount Elbert represented the culmination of 60 years of psychological experimentation refined into a sophisticated operation that bore little resemblance to the crude installations of the original Aurora program. Tom's geological analysis had identified the location using coordinates provided by David Chen, cross-referenced with natural cave formations that would support extensive underground construction. Sarah tested her father's access badge at the facility's concealed entrance, a steel door built into what appeared to be a natural rock formation hundreds of feet below the mountain's surface. The electronic lock accepted Robert Harrison's credentials without question, confirming that his security clearance had been maintained throughout his retirement as insurance against potential exposure of the program he had spent decades documenting the facility's interior, revealed the evolution of Aurora techniques from experimental procedures to operational applications that were being used on hundreds of current subjects. Tom's geological expertise proved crucial as they navigated corridors carved from living rock, following natural cave systems that had been modified and expanded to create a complex that extended deep into the mountain's core. Marcus carried sophisticated recording equipment designed to document evidence that could expose Minebridge operations to international scrutiny and legal accountability. His 20 years of investigative experience had taught him the importance of gathering multiple forms of proof: audio recordings, video documentation, and physical evidence that would withstand legal challenges and government attempts at denial or discreditation. The first level of the facility contained administrative offices and research laboratories that looked like legitimate medical installations, complete with modern equipment and professional staff who appeared to be conducting routine scientific research. Sarah's librarian training helped her identify and copy crucial documents that revealed the scope of current operations: subject intake records, experimental protocols, and budget authorizations that proved Minebridge was processing hundreds of people annually using techniques identical to those pioneered by Aurora Telena, had insisted on accompanying them despite her advanced age and the obvious dangers involved in infiltrating an active government facility. Her first-hand knowledge of Aurora procedures allowed her to interpret what they were seeing and guide them toward the most important evidence, while her presence also provided emotional support for Sarah as she struggled to comprehend the full scope of her father's involvement in these operations. The second level housed what David Chen had described as processing units, individual chambers where subjects underwent the systematic personality breakdown and reconstruction that formed the core of Minebridge operations. Sarah found detailed records showing that current procedures had been refined based on 60 years of experience, but the fundamental approach remained identical to what Aurora had pioneered in the 1960s. Marcus began documenting the psychological manipulation equipment with methodical precision, recording sophisticated technology that combined pharmaceutical interventions with sensory deprivation and subliminal programming techniques. The advancement in technology was remarkable, but the objective remained the same: complete control over human consciousness and behavior for intelligence and operational purposes. The third level contained active subject quarters, and it was here that their mission transformed from documentation to rescue as they encountered people who were currently undergoing Minebridge processing. Sarah found herself face-to-face with individuals whose personalities were being systematically destroyed and rebuilt according to predetermined specifications. People who were victims of the same program that had haunted her father. For 50 years, Tom's geological knowledge became crucial as they planned the evacuation of current subjects through natural cave systems that connected to the facility but provided escape routes that security systems hadn't anticipated. His understanding of underground terrain and mountain geological structures allowed them to navigate passages that would bring the rescued subjects to safety while avoiding detection by facility security forces. The coordinated exposure began at exactly midnight Mountain Time, with Aurora survivors across 7 states simultaneously releasing documentation to news organizations, human rights groups, and international oversight bodies. Elena's network had spent 60 years preparing for this moment, establishing secure communication channels and trusted contacts who could ensure the evidence reached audiences beyond the reach of government suppression efforts. Sarah initiated the digital upload from the Minebridge facility itself, using her father's access credentials to penetrate the program's own communication systems and broadcast complete documentation of current operations to recipients worldwide. The irony of using Aurora's security clearances to expose Aurora's continuation was not lost on her as she watched 60 years of carefully hidden evidence stream across global networks. Tom led the evacuation of current Minebridge subjects through the cave system he had mapped during their infiltration, his geological expertise proving crucial as they navigated underground passages in darkness while moving 17 people of varying psychological states through terrain that required precise knowledge of rock formations and underground water flows to traverse safely. Marcus positioned himself in the facility's communication center, using his journalistic contacts to coordinate simultaneous revelations across multiple time zones and legal jurisdictions. His 20 years of investigating Aurora had prepared him for this moment, and he worked methodically to ensure that evidence reached news organizations in countries where government pressure would be less effective in suppressing coverage. The facility's security systems detected their activities within hours of the initial uploads, triggering automatic lockdown procedures designed to prevent unauthorized access or exit. But Tom's geological surveys had identified alternative routes through natural cave systems that connected to surface exits miles from the main facility. Passages that security protocols hadn't anticipated because they weren't part of the original construction. Elena remained with the most severely damaged subjects, using techniques the survivor network had developed over decades to provide psychological support during the confusion and disorientation that accompanied extraction from ongoing processing. Her first-hand experience with Aurora procedures made her uniquely qualified to help current victims understand what had been done to them and begin the long process of psychological recovery. Sarah confronted Director Phillips in his secure office on the facility's command level, using her father's access codes to penetrate areas that should have been completely restricted to unauthorized personnel. Phillips was a man in his 70s who had spent his entire career advancing Aurora research, beginning as a junior psychologist in the original program and eventually rising to direct current operations that processed hundreds of subjects annually. "Your father was a remarkable man," Phillips told Sarah with what seemed like genuine respect. "His documentation was so thorough and accurate that we used his geological surveys when we expanded these facilities. He understood the program better than most of the people who actually worked on it, which made his opposition particularly problematic for our operations." Phillips revealed that Robert Harrison's opposition to Aurora had been more complex than simple moral objection to psychological experimentation. He had recognized that the techniques being developed could be refined and improved for legitimate applications, but he had insisted that they should be used only for medical purposes rather than intelligence operations or population control mechanisms. Sarah realized that her father's moral struggle had been even more complicated than she had understood from his letters and documentation. He had chosen to work within the system rather than destroy it completely, believing that he could influence the program's direction and prevent its worst applications while preserving research that might eventually benefit humanity. Through legitimate medical applications, Tom's geological knowledge became crucial as facility security forces attempted to prevent their escape through conventional exit routes. The underground complex had been designed with sophisticated containment measures, but those systems assumed that intruders would attempt to exit through constructed passages rather than natural cave formations that connected to surface locations miles from the main facility. Marcus sacrificed himself to ensure that the evidence upload reached completion and that news organizations received all the documentation needed to expose Minebridge operations comprehensively to international audiences. His decision to remain behind and continue transmitting while security forces closed in represented the culmination of 20 years of investigation and his determination that Aurora's secrets would finally be revealed regardless of personal cost. Elena coordinated with the Survivor Network to provide immediate assistance to the subjects they were evacuating, ensuring that people who had been systematically traumatized would receive appropriate psychological and medical care from professionals who understood the specific nature of Aurora-related damage. Her 60 years of experience helping Aurora victims had prepared her to organize support systems that could address the unique needs of people recovering from systematic personality manipulation. The coordinated global media release began at exactly 6 p.m. Eastern Time, with news organizations across 6 continents simultaneously broadcasting Sarah's live testimony alongside comprehensive documentation of Project Aurora's 60-year history and contemporary continuation. The synchronized revelation overwhelmed government capacity to suppress information as evidence flooded multiple channels simultaneously across different legal jurisdictions. Sarah's live video testimony reached an estimated 50 million viewers worldwide within the first hour. Her calm and detailed presentation providing credible witness testimony that gave human context to the clinical documentation being released through multiple media outlets. Her father's story and her own journey of discovery created emotional connections that made Aurora's abstract horrors comprehensible to ordinary people who had never imagined such systematic violations of human dignity. Tom led coordinated rescue operations at 3 additional Aurora facilities, using his geological expertise to guide law enforcement teams through underground complexes where 47 current subjects were being held in various stages of psychological processing. His maps and structural analysis proved crucial in navigating installations that had been designed to prevent external access while ensuring that victims could be safely evacuated. Elena's emergence from 60 years of hiding provided international media with a credible witness whose detailed knowledge of Aurora procedures gave authority to survivor testimony that might otherwise have been dismissed as conspiracy theories or fabricated accusations. Her willingness to sacrifice her anonymity for the cause of justice inspired other survivors worldwide to break their silence and provide additional confirmation of Aurora crimes. Government response was immediate but ineffective, as official denials were contradicted by overwhelming documentation and survivor testimony that provided specific details about personnel, locations, and procedures that could be independently verified. The comprehensive nature of evidence made traditional damage control strategies impossible to implement successfully, forcing acknowledgement of systematic crimes that had been hidden for decades. Law enforcement agencies in multiple countries began simultaneous raids on Aurora facilities, rescuing current subjects and seizing additional evidence that confirmed the accuracy of documentation provided by the Survivor Network. The coordinated operations prevented destruction of proof and elimination of witnesses, while providing additional validation of the systematic nature of Aurora crimes. Corporate Aurora operations faced immediate exposure as business partnerships with government programs became public knowledge, triggering investigations by regulatory agencies and human rights organizations that had previously been unaware of private sector involvement in psychological experimentation. The commercial applications of Aurora techniques represented billions of dollars in profits that had been generated through systematic violation of human rights. 1 year after the Aurora revelations had transformed global understanding of government experimentation and human rights violations, Sarah and Tom stood in the memorial garden dedicated to Aurora victims at the site of the original mountain cabin where their journey had begun. The weathered structure had been preserved as a historical monument, but the surrounding area now hosted a comprehensive educational center that documented the full scope of psychological Experimentation crimes. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Human Rights had become an international organization providing support for Aurora survivors while advocating for stronger protections against future government and corporate experimentation on human subjects. Elena served as the Foundation's primary witness coordinator, helping hundreds of survivors worldwide receive medical care, legal representation, and psychological support needed for recovery from systematic trauma. Tom had published a comprehensive geological guide for identifying hidden underground facilities, providing investigators and human rights organizations with practical tools for locating installations that might house ongoing experimental programs. His expertise had proven crucial in exposing Aurora operations, and his manual ensured that similar detection capabilities would be available to future investigators working to prevent systematic human rights violations. Elena's Survivor Network had evolved into a formal organization with legal status and government funding to provide comprehensive services for victims of psychological experimentation. Her 60 years of hiding had ended with international recognition as a human rights advocate whose courage had inspired global accountability efforts and legislative reforms protecting vulnerable populations. The legal aftermath of Aurora revelations had resulted in criminal prosecutions, civil settlements, and international treaties establishing new standards for human experimentation oversight that would prevent future programs from operating without appropriate legal and ethical constraints. While some perpetrators had escaped justice through death or diplomatic immunity, the systematic exposure of Aurora crimes had created precedents that would protect future generations from similar violations. Sarah's book documenting their investigation and her father's legacy had become required. Reading in university courses on ethics, human rights, and government accountability, ensuring that future generations would understand the importance of individual conscience in resisting institutional power. Robert Harrison's story had inspired other families to examine their histories and question official narratives about classified programs that had affected their relatives throughout the Cold War-era congressional legislation had established independent oversight mechanisms for all government research involving human subjects, while international agreements had created monitoring systems designed to prevent Aurora-style programs from operating in secret. The institutional changes represented partial victory in the ongoing struggle between individual rights and government power, though vigilance would be required to maintain these protections against future threats. As they prepared to leave the memorial garden for what they knew would be their final visit as private citizens, Sarah placed a fresh copy of her father's letter beside the bronze plaque honoring Aurora victims. The mountains that had hidden systematic crimes for decades now stood as symbols of the power of truth to overcome institutional secrecy and the courage of ordinary people to demand justice from those who wielded authority without moral constraint. Their quiet retirement had been forever transformed into a mission that would continue for the rest of their lives. But it was work that gave their later years meaning and purpose beyond anything they had imagined possible when they first discovered that mysterious cabin during a simple anniversary hike in the Colorado mountains. The investigation that had begun with a chance discovery during a storm had revealed layers of conspiracy that extended far beyond what any of them had initially comprehended. The documents David Chen had provided painted a picture of systematic human rights violations that continued into the present day, with Project Mindbridge representing just one component of a vast network of psychological experimentation programs that operated under various names and administrative structures throughout the federal government and its corporate partners. Sarah's analysis of the contemporary contracts revealed that Aurora techniques had been commercialized and exported to allied countries, creating an international market for psychological manipulation technologies that generated billions of dollars in revenue while violating fundamental principles of human dignity. Private military contractors had developed training programs based on Aurora research, selling these services to law enforcement agencies, foreign governments, and corporate security firms without any disclosure of the technique's origins in systematic torture of unwilling subjects. The pharmaceutical industry's involvement was particularly disturbing, as drug companies had developed specialized medications designed to enhance the effectiveness of psychological manipulation procedures while minimizing the visible side effects that might alert medical professionals or family members to what was happening to the subjects. These substances were being marketed for legitimate medical applications, while simultaneously being used to facilitate memory suppression, personality reconstruction, and behavioral control in Aurora-derived programs. Tom's geological expertise had proven crucial, not only in locating hidden facilities, but in understanding the scope of the underground infrastructure that had been constructed over decades of secret operations. His analysis revealed that the cave systems and underground installations formed a network spanning multiple states, with transportation tunnels and communication links that allowed coordinated operations across vast geographical areas while maintaining complete concealment from conventional detection methods. The corporate partnership agreements Elena had discovered included provisions for sharing research results between government and private facilities, ensuring that advances in psychological manipulation techniques would benefit both sectors while maintaining the secrecy that protected operations from legal challenge or public opposition. Technology companies had developed artificial intelligence systems designed to implement Aurora techniques on a massive scale, using social media platforms and digital communication networks to identify psychological vulnerabilities and implement manipulation strategies that could affect millions of people without their knowledge or consent. Marcus's international contacts had revealed that Aurora techniques were being used in developing countries where regulatory oversight was minimal and legal. Protections for human subjects were essentially non-existent. The globalization of Aurora represented a form of psychological colonialism that exploited vulnerable populations for commercial profit while serving the strategic interests of governments and corporations that viewed human rights as obstacles to operational effectiveness. The Mindbridge facility's operational scope had been far more extensive than their initial investigation had revealed. Sarah's father's access credentials had provided entry to only a small portion of the underground complex, which extended for miles through natural and artificial passages that connected to other installations throughout the region. The facility housed not only current experimental subjects, but also training centers where personnel learned to implement Aurora techniques in various operational contexts. Elena's knowledge of the facility's history had helped them understand how the original Aurora program had evolved and expanded over 6 decades of continuous operation. The techniques pioneered in the 1960s had been refined through generations of researchers who had built upon the work of their predecessors while developing new applications that took advantage of advancing technology and changing social conditions. The Survivor Network's documentation efforts had preserved evidence of Aurora operations that spanned multiple generations of victims and perpetrators. Families had been destroyed across decades as the program targeted not only primary subjects but also their relatives who might pose security risks or possess information that could threaten operational security. The psychological damage extended far beyond the immediate victims to include family members who had spent their lives wondering what had happened to loved ones who had simply disappeared without explanation. Dorothy Williams's medical knowledge had been particularly valuable in understanding how Aurora techniques had been adapted for different populations and purposes. The program had developed specialized protocols for children, elderly subjects, and individuals with various mental health conditions, demonstrating a systematic approach to psychological manipulation that took advantage of vulnerabilities specific to different demographic groups. James Redmond's experience as a military subject had provided insight into how Aurora techniques had been integrated into legitimate military training programs, allowing the program to process large numbers of subjects under the cover of routine military service. Many veterans who believed they had participated in standard military exercises had actually been subjected to experimental procedures that left them with permanent psychological damage disguised as combat-related trauma. Margaret Zantos's linguistic expertise had revealed the international scope of Aurora operations through her translation of communications between American facilities and similar programs in allied countries. The coordination between different national programs demonstrated that Aurora was part of a broader international effort to develop and implement psychological manipulation techniques for intelligence and military purposes. The revelation of Aurora's contemporary applications had transformed Sarah and Tom's understanding of their mission from historical documentation to active intervention in ongoing crimes. The evidence they had gathered proved that hundreds of people were currently being subjected to Aurora techniques in facilities that operated with government approval and unlimited funding, making their investigation a matter of immediate urgency rather than historical curiosity. David Chen's security clearance had provided access to budget documents and personnel files that revealed the true scope of current Aurora operations. The annual funding for Minebridge and related programs exceeded the entire budget of many government agencies, demonstrating the priority given to psychological experimentation research within the intelligence community and defense establishment. The facility's security systems had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of infiltration and documentation that Sarah, Tom, and their allies had accomplished. The fact that they had succeeded in penetrating Minebridge and extracting evidence suggested that the program's security measures, while sophisticated, were not prepared for the combination of insider knowledge, geological expertise, and moral determination that their group had brought to the investigation. Elena's decision to emerge from hiding after 60 years had represented an enormous personal risk that demonstrated her commitment to preventing Aurora's continuation and expansion. Her testimony provided crucial validation for the historical documentation while establishing her credibility as someone who had witnessed the program's evolution from its early experimental phase to its current operational status. The coordinated revelation strategy had been designed to overwhelm the government's capacity for damage control while providing protection for witnesses through the sheer volume of concurrent disclosures. The international scope of the revelations had prevented any single government from suppressing the information while creating diplomatic pressure that made denial impossible and accountability unavoidable. Sarah's lived testimony had reached audiences far beyond the initial news broadcasts, as recordings of her presentation were shared through social media platforms and alternative news sources that extended the reach of their revelations beyond traditional media outlets that might be subject to government pressure or corporate influence. Her calm, detailed presentation had provided credible witness testimony that made the abstract horror of psychological experimentation comprehensible to ordinary people who had never imagined such systematic violations of human dignity could occur in democratic societies. The rescue operations at Aurora facilities had saved lives while providing additional evidence that validated the survivors' testimony and documentation. The physical evidence seized during these operations had included not only documents and equipment but also biological samples and medical records that proved the systematic nature of human experimentation that had been conducted Without informed consent or ethical oversight, the international response to aurora revelations had included not only media coverage and government investigations, but also academic research and legal scholarship that established the historical significance of the disclosures while developing frameworks for preventing similar programs in the future. Universities had established research centers dedicated to studying government experimentation and developing oversight mechanisms that would protect vulnerable populations from institutional abuse. The memorial garden at the original cabin site had become a pilgrimage destination for people who wanted to honor aurora victims while learning about the importance of individual conscience in resisting institutional power. The Educational Center provided comprehensive documentation of psychological experimentation crimes while offering resources for people who suspected they or their family members might have been affected by similar programs. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation's work had expanded beyond aurora survivors to include victims of other government experimentation programs that had operated under various names and administrative structures throughout American history. The Foundation's research had revealed patterns of abuse that extended back to the early 20th century, demonstrating that aurora was part of a broader tradition of using vulnerable populations for experimental purposes without adequate legal protection or ethical oversight. Tom's geological guide had been translated into multiple languages and distributed to human rights organizations worldwide, providing practical tools for identifying hidden facilities that might house ongoing experimental programs. His methodology had been adapted for different geographical regions and geological conditions, making it possible for investigators to locate concealed installations in various environmental contexts. Elena's formal organization had established partnerships with international human rights groups, creating a global network for supporting victims of psychological experimentation while advocating for stronger legal protections against government and corporate abuse. The organization's work had influenced legislative reforms in multiple countries, establishing precedents that would protect future generations from systematic violations of human rights and dignity. The legal proceedings resulting from aurora revelations had established important precedents for holding government officials and corporate executives accountable for crimes committed under the cover of national security classifications. While some perpetrators had escaped prosecution through death or diplomatic immunity, the systematic documentation of aurora crimes had created legal frameworks that would make future accountability more likely and effective. Congressional oversight had been strengthened through legislation that required independent monitoring of all government research involving human subjects, while international agreements had established coordinated oversight mechanisms that would prevent aurora-style programs from simply moving to countries with weaker legal protections. The institutional changes represented significant progress in protecting individual rights against government power, though continued vigilance would be required to maintain these protections against future threats. As Sarah and Tom prepared to leave the memorial garden, they reflected on how their chance discovery had led to revelations that had changed not only their own lives, but the lives of countless people who had been affected by aurora and similar programs. Their quiet retirement had been replaced by a mission that would continue for the rest of their lives, but it was work that had given their later years meaning and purpose beyond anything they had imagined possible when they first sought shelter in that mysterious cabin during a Colorado mountain storm. The final phase of their investigation had revealed the true scope of aurora's legacy and its continuation into the 21st century through programs that operated with even greater sophistication and legal protection than their historical predecessors. The techniques developed in the 1960s had been refined through decades of research and technological advancement, creating capabilities for psychological manipulation that exceeded anything the original Aurora researchers had imagined possible. Sarah's analysis of contemporary documents had revealed that Aurora techniques were being used in domestic law enforcement applications, with police departments receiving training in psychological manipulation methods disguised as enhanced interrogation and behavioral analysis instruction. The integration of Aurora-derived techniques into routine law enforcement represented a fundamental threat to constitutional protections against self-incrimination and due process that had been established through centuries of legal development. Tom's geological surveys had identified dozens of additional facilities that matched the construction patterns and geological features associated with Aurora operations, suggesting that the underground infrastructure supporting psychological experimentation programs was far more extensive than even their comprehensive investigation had revealed. The network of hidden installations represented billions of dollars in construction and maintenance costs that had been funded through classified budget allocations spanning multiple decades. The international scope of Aurora's continuation had been revealed through diplomatic communications and intelligence-sharing agreements that demonstrated systematic cooperation between allied countries in developing and implementing psychological manipulation techniques for intelligence, military, and domestic security purposes. The globalization of Aurora represented a coordinated effort to establish psychological control capabilities that transcended national boundaries and legal jurisdictions. Elena's testimony had established the continuity between historical Aurora operations and contemporary programs, providing eyewitness evidence that connected past crimes to ongoing violations of human rights and dignity. Her courage in breaking 60 years of silence had inspired other survivors to come forward with testimony that revealed the systematic nature of government experimentation across multiple decades and administrations. The corporate involvement in Aurora's commercialization had created a self-perpetuating system where private companies had financial incentives to develop and market psychological manipulation technologies, regardless of their ethical implications or legal status. The profit motive had transformed government crimes into commercial opportunities that generated billions of dollars in revenue, while expanding the application of Aurora techniques beyond government operations to include private sector uses. Dorothy Williams's medical expertise had been crucial in documenting the long-term health effects of Aurora procedures on survivors who had lived for decades with psychological and physical damage caused by systematic torture disguised as medical research. Her testimony had established the pattern of permanent injury that characterized Aurora victims, while demonstrating the medical community's failure to recognize and treat trauma caused by government experimentation. James Redmond's experience as a military subject had revealed how Aurora techniques had been integrated into legitimate military training and operations, creating a system where soldiers could be subjected to experimental procedures without their knowledge or informed consent. His testimony had established the pattern of deception and exploitation that characterized military applications of Aurora research, while demonstrating the long-term psychological damage suffered by service members who had been used as experimental subjects. Margaret Santos's linguistic skills had provided access to international communications that revealed the coordination between Aurora operations and similar programs in allied countries, demonstrating that psychological experimentation represented a systematic international effort rather than isolated national programs. Her translations had established the global scope of government crimes, while revealing the diplomatic and intelligence networks that protected these operations from exposure and accountability. David Chen's intelligence background had provided access to contemporary documents that proved Aurora's continuation under different names and administrative structures, establishing the connection between historical crimes and ongoing operations that threatened current victims. His decision to break decades of silence had provided the crucial evidence needed to prove that Aurora had never ended, but had evolved and expanded under government protection. The Mindbridge facility had represented only one component of a vast network of installations that continued Aurora research and operations using modern technology and more sophisticated legal protections against exposure and prosecution. The facility's capabilities exceeded anything available to the original Aurora program, demonstrating how government investment in psychological experimentation had grown and intensified over decades of secret development. Marcus's sacrifice had ensured that the evidence of Aurora's continuation reached international audiences who could demand accountability from their own governments and international organizations responsible for protecting human rights. His 20 years of investigation had provided the foundation for comprehensive exposure of systematic crimes that spanned multiple countries and decades of government protection. The rescue operations at Aurora facilities had saved dozens of current victims while providing physical evidence that validated survivor testimony and documentary proof of ongoing crimes. The successful evacuation of subjects demonstrated that intervention was possible when people with appropriate skills and moral courage were willing to risk everything to protect innocent victims of government experimentation. The coordinated, global revelation had created international pressure for accountability that prevented any single government from suppressing the evidence or eliminating witnesses through the usual methods of intimidation and elimination. The simultaneous disclosure across multiple countries and media outlets had overwhelmed government capacity for damage control while ensuring that the truth reached audiences who could demand justice and institutional reform. The legal proceedings that followed Aurora revelations had established important precedents for prosecuting government officials and corporate executives who participated in systematic human rights violations under the cover of national security classifications. While complete justice remained elusive due to the death of key perpetrators and the protection of others through diplomatic immunity, the legal framework for future accountability had been strengthened through legislation and international agreements. The educational impact of Aurora revelations had extended far beyond immediate legal and political consequences to include academic research and public education that would protect future generations from similar abuses. Universities had established research programs dedicated to studying government experimentation, while developing ethical frameworks and oversight mechanisms that would prevent the repetition of historical crimes. Sarah's book about their investigation had become a foundational text for understanding the relationship between government power and individual rights in democratic societies, providing a case study of how ordinary citizens could challenge institutional corruption and demand accountability from authorities who claimed exemption from moral and legal constraints. The book's influence extended beyond academic circles to inspire activism and advocacy by people who recognized the ongoing relevance of Aurora's lessons to contemporary political and social issues. Tom's geological methodology had been adopted by human rights organizations worldwide as a tool for locating hidden facilities that might house ongoing experimental programs or other violations of human rights and dignity. His work had demonstrated how scientific expertise could be applied to human rights investigation while providing practical tools for people working to protect Vulnerable populations from institutional abuse, Elena's foundation had created a permanent institutional legacy that would continue the work of supporting Aurora survivors while advocating for stronger legal protections against government and corporate experimentation on human subjects. The Foundation's work had influenced policy development in multiple countries while establishing international standards for protecting vulnerable populations from systematic abuse. The memorial garden where Sarah and Tom stood represented more than just remembrance of Aurora victims. It symbolized the triumph of individual conscience over institutional power and the possibility that truth could ultimately prevail against systematic deception and violence. The garden's peaceful setting belied the horror of what had been revealed, but its existence proved that even the most carefully hidden crimes could be exposed when people found the courage to demand justice. As they walked away from the memorial garden for the final time, Sarah and Tom understood that their work would continue as long as they lived. But they also knew that they had accomplished something significant that would protect future generations from the kind of systematic abuse that had destroyed so many lives over the decades of Aurora's operation. Their chance discovery of a mountain cabin had led to revelations that changed history and established new protections for human rights and dignity that would endure long after they were gone.